This is Humankind Game by Amplitude Studios, and today, with some hopefully new and fast-paced gameplay in the background for you, I'm going to take you through my top 5 reasons why Humankind Game is doomed to fail, or at least have a rough time. These are my top 5 concerns about Humankind. As we near its release, we are now days away. These concerns will carry through its release as well into the first 6 months of the game. Without any further ado, I suggest you sit back and get comfortable. Let's discuss. For starters, I do want to cover its release and my concerns around release day hype. Now, I've heard you guys in the comments mention this to me as well. It's something we're all a little bit confused about, but I think we have some reasons why we should be a little more concerned than we'd realize. For starters, there's an immense pressure surrounding the release for Humankind. It is the most hyped game that Amplitude Studios have ever released or worked on by far. There are other titles, I guarantee you, are small fry in comparison to the scale of Humankind, to the massive popularity of Humankind, and indeed for the number of sales it will achieve. Mark my words, and come back to me in a year if I'm wrong on it, but I guarantee you there's an immense social pressure on the team, right? Because the team that make this game, they're people just like you and me. They're art developers, their social media team, the actual creators of the game, the publishers, all of them are people, and they're under immense pressure. And I think that pressure will flow through into the systems behind Humankind. And all of this release hype, all of this build-up, which is partly brought about, I admit, by people like me, making videos about Humankind, engaging in discussions with people like you in the comments. It helps to build a massive hype, and there is a fear that the game won't be able to live up to it, both because of the social pressures, but also their systems behind the game. This game, Humankind, will receive massive airtime, lots of build-up, massive community interest and support. And I wonder, and this takes me through into my second concern, I wonder about the specific launch of the game. I predict this will be a tough launch. I don't necessarily mean a tough launch for us as individual consumers, as individual players of the game, or indeed if you're just sitting back relaxing with a nice cup of coffee watching the game. I don't know if consumers, players, and viewers will necessarily feel it, but what I do know is it's gonna be a difficult one. Firstly, the release timing is a real challenge. Thinking about the global context of the world, it's not necessarily an easy time to release a product. Thankfully, Humankind, I believe, will almost exclusively be a digital release, although I love you guys who are still going in there and ordering collector's editions in person if they're available. I would have loved to pick one up myself anyway. I think the global pressure on their servers, as I've mentioned, will be difficult, but also, as a player, if you happen to encounter difficulties, and let's be real, a game launching as significantly as Humankind, with that massive interest in the launch, a global launch which doesn't at this point appear to be staggered either, so it's just going to be open the floodgates and go. Their servers are going to be under immense pressure, but also their troubleshooting teams and so on and so forth. So for those of us who will, unfortunately, inevitably be encountering issues in the beginning of the game, whether that's 1% or 50% of us, we don't know. But what we do know is that regardless, the scale of difficulty will be absolutely anything unlike Amplitude Studios have had to deal with before. Also, there's an immense pressure on the launch in terms of that launch day release of the game as well. Now, we know already that some patches are coming to the game. There are going to be updates to Humankind on day one from the previous versions that we've played and seen. That is, of course, largely thanks to the fact that Humankind has had some significant closed beta access and open development periods. So definitely, we've already had a chance to play with it. We've already had a chance to touch Humankind Game, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the day one launch will be difficult because that immense popularity. Think of all of the live streams. I'll be guilty of this as well. Do stay tuned for that, by the way. But all of the live streams, all of the video reviews, all of the written reviews, media attention around the release is going to be so significant that if, and dare I say when, things do go wrong, and I don't necessarily mean things that can be fixed easily with a patch. I mean significant troubles with launch. I mean significant balance issues, which we'll get to in a minute. I'm thinking of games like Spore, for example, that had huge popularity and then eventually dropped to nothing after a really shaky release and a really clunky title being published. But also, I'm thinking of other games that have actually found success after a difficult launch, but it definitely stunted their growth in a big way and really ruined their reputation. And I guess that's the core here. It's a reputational issue. Think of things like Civilization Beyond Earth, or a better example maybe No Man's Sky. These games launched poorly for various reasons, had a really rough launch, largely due to game mechanics, but also other features outside of the developer's control as well as within their control, things like servers and blah blah blah. Either way, they lucked out with launch and eventually, largely through DLC granted, improved to be actually significantly better than what they were initially reviewed at. I don't want that to be Humankind's future though. Even in that scenario, that's a really stunted growth pattern for what could have been some really fantastic games. And I think that, to reiterate, Humankind's launch period will be its second potential area for really big weaknesses and its second potential flaw. Thirdly, and shifting along a timeline here, I'm going to move into the actual gameplay itself and talk to you about cultures. If you haven't seen my video on them already, I think it's a banger. Basically, there are over 1 million, up to potentially 1.6 million different combinations of cultures you can play at. For those uncultured swines among us, cultures in Humankind Game are the equivalent of civs. They are civilizations like you would play in Civilization 5 or Sid Meier's Civilization 6 or whatever game you're playing. These cultures play like civs, okay? They each have their own unique building and unit and cultural trait that carries through the game, regardless of whether you change culture as you move through the eras. So they're pretty important. They have really significant strengths, and they carry through. When you have over 1 million combinations of those, my biggest concern, and indeed the thing that I think will be the greatest challenge for Humankind throughout its whole life cycle, from now, when we've played it at the beta, at release, right the way through for years from now where it's had a full DLC suite, which I imagine it will have. How do you balance these combinations of cultures? The answer, in short, is you can't. And indeed, I am personally largely of the opinion that if everything is super, nothing is. To quote Syndrome from The Incredibles, if everybody is a superhero, no one is. And by that I mean if everything is really strong and powerful, then you end up in a world where actually that's okay. It's balanced because it's all strong. What I worry about, though, really in particular, is things like, for example, multiplayer. What happens then when certain combos are just much stronger and you don't have necessarily AI, which I'll touch on later in the video, that isn't able to, gamify it in a way that a human could. But if you have 6 humans playing against each other, you have beelining for specific cultures that combo well together, you have all kinds of intricacies coming through, and I just don't know if you can even balance Humankind for multiplayer, to be honest. I really don't know. For a more competitive multiplayer game I'm talking about here, of course, I'm not talking about you playing against your little sister. I'm talking about competitive multiplayer games or games where people are playing to win. I think that's going to be really difficult, particularly to balance cultures around that. However, though, I do also think even in the single-player context, we don't want to have situations emerging where certain cultures and certain eras are kind of like a must-pick or an always-pick, right? And maybe you can salvage it down the line in future eras of the game, that's fine, but I'm thinking now within specific eras where there are 10 cultures to choose from. I don't want it to become a race to a culture, right? Oh, you have to get to the Greeks. If you don't get to the Greeks first, you're out, or whatever it may be. I don't want that to be the case, and that impacts single player and multiplayer, because you end up with players being disappointed, disadvantaged, or turned away by the fact that one culture is significantly better than the others, whether they're playing it or not, actually, in many cases, right? It becomes too easy or too hard. Something really important for Amplitude Studios, the developers of Humankind, to be really astutely aware of, and I'm not sure how that one will play out, as I say, over the life cycle of Humankind as well. We'll have to see. Fourth up, and kind of related to that, but not really actually, late game balance. How do you balance a late game in a 4X strategy game is a huge question across the board. We have always seen 4X games struggle with their late game. I could think about Endless Legend from Amplitude Studios, Endless Space from Amplitude Studios, again, the developers of Humankind. Their games struggle, but not only theirs, also games like Humankind. Let's think about Civilization 6, for example, a great example. The late game becomes stagnant and boring, partly due to the AI, which I'll cover later, spoiler alert, but also really just because of that snowballing in strength that you get as a player as you build up and up and up and up, but also the timing of errors. Humankind seems to have, at least from what we've played already, really focus on those early game errors. And more often than not, you've either sort of won the game or the outcome is predetermined in another way, whether it's sort of predetermined, oh, I'm eventually going to win, there's nothing these people can do, or oh, I'm going to lose and there's probably nothing I can do, right? By sort of the late mid-game, you've probably reached that point. That's the trouble that Humankind is dealing with. We're spending too much time in the early game and we're not getting to play with the late game toys that we'd like to play with. It is, after all, the era we're living in at the moment, right? The contemporary era. We want to experience that, or at least have the option to experience it in a meaningful way. In terms of solutions here, I think they're actually quite simple. And so I think this is definitely one of Humankind's greatest weaknesses, by far and away from what we saw from the beta period. But it is actually one that's quite easy to solve. You adjust the error timings. You make it so that we require fewer score, fame, error stars, however you want to put it, to advance through the earlier errors, and then perhaps that we require more in the later ones. That speeds up the in-game inadvertently by making it easier for players to progress through it. A really simple solution. There could be more complicated ones. I'm open to your thoughts in the comments, which, by the way, I will be responding to every single one as I can, so please do take the time to drop your thoughts on anything I've discussed today, anything related to Humankind, or just some random words. I'd love to have a discussion with you in the comments. Which ties me nicely through into my fifth and final point, and that is the AI. And this is one that I've heard again a lot about from you guys. AI, again, another problematic point for other 4X strategy games as well. The likes of Civilization 6, for example. My goodness, there's a whole video on that. But on Humankind's AI, we should be worried, I think. The beta really did show us that the AI wasn't the best, okay? And I'm particularly worried about this because of my fourth point that I just talked about around late game balancing and the pace of the late game. Snowballing was very easy. And if we make it so that the early game is passed through quicker, which incentivizes more late game play, which is what Humankind should move towards and sort of needs to move towards, otherwise we'll never get to play it. The downside is that lets us snowball against the AI in an even bigger way, because we get to the late game faster, we get through our technologies faster, theoretically. But even if we exclude that and purely focus on the AI that we've played with so far, I don't think it's any secret to anyone that the AI can't keep up with the human player. How do we balance that? Unfortunately, because the AI is so limited, and this is its deepest strength, its deepest weakness, the only way to fix that is to give it more things. So you give it more science, you give it plus 50%. Or you give it more military units, so at the start of the game they have 5 instead of 2. Or you give it an extra settler or an extra city at the start of the game. Unfortunately, that really doesn't get around the fundamental flaws that, even if you give the AI these advantages, they don't know how to utilize them moving forward. So they rush you down, or they eventually lose to you, superseding them in terms of intelligence. Am I here to offer the solution to machine learning and artificial intelligence? Absolutely not. However, I think that AI will be a really complicated issue for Humankind, more so than any other 4X strategy game that has focused on human development. I'm looking at you, the Civilization franchise. Purely because there are so many different combinations, not just with the cultures that I've already discussed, but this, the tech tree, and the civics tree, and religion. While it's presented in quite a simple and easy-ish way to understand and interpret, difficult for the AI to layer and stack opportunity costs against each other. Should I build this science building or this production one? Should I focus on money? Should I focus on food? In particular, and this one will really catch it out, and I found it caught it out a lot in the beta, should I build up an army to attack or defend? The AI was unable to do that, and I'm concerned about that combat AI as a particular point of focus moving forward as well for Humankind. I think that's going to be a significant issue, not just for the auto-resolve battles, but also for the manually resolved ones. The AI in Humankind does need to up its game to keep up with the complexities, particularly if the developers are interested in adding more to the game, which they undoubtedly will with some Humankind DLC moving forwards. Thank you very much for watching today's video and hanging out with me. If you stuck around till the end, I really appreciate it. And until next time, everybody, I'll see you then. Take care. Bye-bye.